To begin with, just a brief introduction of what we are trying to do here. So this is planned to be an open discussion. So the methodology and the arguments which are going to be provided are intended to provide an open environment where we are going to have a discussion, that is you in the audience and Mr. Flavell. So we expect you people to feel free to ask questions and give contributions. So feel free to express yourself. A brief introduction about Mr. Flavell, though he will do most of the talking after this. Mr. Flavell studied at the University of Sussex, sociology, and he is a person who is interested in logic, religion, and science, and he holds such debates in other places. He is from the United Kingdom, that is where he is, so he is visiting us to come and have this discussion with us. So without further ado, let me invite Bill to come to the stage, and please give me a round of applause.
Thank you very much, welcome, and particular thanks to the UNZA Students Physics Association for inviting me, and of course thanks to everyone here for coming to participate in the discussion. This is actually my first trip to Zambia, so I'm delighted to be here, and what I've seen so far, I love the country, so thank you for inviting me. Before we get started, can I just, the people at the back, can you hear me clearly? Before we get started, I know that people are here from different disciplines, so could I just see the physicists here? Okay, a lot of physicists. The mathematicians? Okay. Biologists? Okay. Chemists? Philosophers? Okay. And humanities. Okay. Now I'd just like to ask you one favour. When we get to difficult questions for me, could I ask the philosophers to only answer the chemistry questions, and the chemists to only ask the philosophy questions? And are there any pastors here? Any clergy? And the clergy, you can ask me any question you like. Thank you. Let's get started. I'm interested in the whole question of science and logic and religion. And what I'm going to talk to you today is the possibility that you could use science to give you an insight into religion. One of the earliest references to that I've ever found is Lao Tzu. He was in the 6th century, a Chinese philosopher, one of the founders, I think, of Taoism. And he said, if lightning is the anger of gods, the gods are concerned mostly with trees. And what I like about that is actually looking at the evidence, and the evidence is lightning mostly strikes trees. So for those people who argue that gods throw lightning down to hurt humans, it's not actually the case. They mostly hurt trees. That's the kind of thinking that we can use for the rest of the session. Let's start with a few things that we actually all know and understand about gods. We all know, even if you haven't believed in God yourself, we all know that humans invent gods, and they invent religions, and they do it big time. They've been doing it for probably 10,000 years, maybe more. They've invented over that period of time maybe 10,000 gods. And I think we all know that most of those gods, if not all of those gods, are invented gods, because they simply cannot all be real. It doesn't make sense. So humans are good at inventing gods. We also know that humans love gods. Humans will die for their gods in some cases. They will kill for their gods. They will make great sacrifices for their gods. The Aztecs, on a monthly basis, would kill children by cutting their hearts out in order to be sure the sun god would rise in the morning. people make enormous sacrifices for their gods, which is a measure of how much they love them. Even though we're pretty sure that most of those gods were invented. We're also good at denying our neighbours' gods. Whatever god you personally believe in, if you believe in one, you almost certainly do not believe your neighbours' gods are true. So somehow we have got this mechanism within our brains for accepting the God we were raised with, but rejecting everyone else's God. And gods can be very demanding. Gods can demand that you sacrifice your life in some cases. But even if they don't ask you to sacrifice your life, they are likely to ask you to give 10% of your salary or a lot of your time. And the thing is that all across the world, whatever God you believe in, people think their gods are worth the cost. So they're worth the sacrifices, whether you're sacrificing people, or your time, or money, or even if you're flying aircraft into buildings, which happens in some cases, which may well be because people believe God's demanded of them, people will make those sacrifices for their gods. So gods, humans invent them, they love them, they deny everyone else's God. So I'd just like to ask a question to you guys, please. Could I see a show of hands? Do you think that science can say anything useful about the existence of God? Okay, that's probably 40%. So we need to make it 100% by the end. Let's talk about detecting God. People who... I'm now going to focus on the Christian God, okay, the God that's known as Elohim or Yahweh. And God will say, people will say, believers will say, God is a spirit. So clearly, spirit cannot be seen. And they say science deals with the natural, not with the supernatural. So science has no leverage with the supernatural. And more than that, they say, and actually God seeks to remain hidden. God only wants to be believed on faith. That's why God doesn't show himself to us. And that sounds biblically sound. There are places in the Bible where it's made clear that you must believe on faith. But let's look at faith a little bit more. What is faith? Well, Hebrews, actually there will not be any Bible verses in this presentation, so don't get intimidated. Hebrews 11:1 tells us that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. What does that mean? Well, I think it means that faith is a requirement for you to believe that things that you hope for will happen, and to be certain that things not seen are true. Things for which you've got no evidence are true. When I put it in my terms, I say faith is believing things with insufficient evidence. Now, let me just talk a little bit more about that. I believe I'm in Zambia right now giving a presentation. And I've got some evidence to believe that. First of all, I booked a ticket, a flight to Zambia, and I got on that flight, and all these signs said it was going to Zambia. And when I arrived, I saw signs at the airport saying, "Welcome to Zambia." And when I arrived, I met some of my friends that I already knew were Zambians and lived here. So that and a lot of other possible bits of evidence suggest to me I'm pretty clear that I'm in Zambia. However, I might not be. It might all be a big ruse. I might actually be in Nigeria. I don't know for certain. But all I'm really trying to highlight to you is that my belief that I'm in Zambia is a belief based on evidence. And even though there is a lot of evidence, I'm not 100% certain that it's true. Sorry. On the other hand, faith is belief without evidence. And the interesting thing about having faith is people will be often certain that what they believe is true, even though when I had a lot of evidence and I wasn't sure, they will have no evidence and be sure. It's interesting. But why can we not use faith to find out the truth? I've got three pictures here of a gentleman who believes that Yahweh created humans from dust. I've got another picture which is a gentleman from Australia, and he believes that Umbikula carved humans from shapeless bundles. And Umbikula is one of the Aboriginal gods, and it's the one that they believe is responsible for creating human life. And I've got a Hindu young lady who believes that Lord Brahma created humans from his own body parts. Now I think we all agree they cannot all be correct. At least 2 of them are wrong, and possibly 3 of them are wrong. But that is why we cannot use faith to determine the truth of a matter. Faith doesn't have a mechanism for you to distinguish those things that are true from those things that are false. In fact, it imposes no limits on what you might believe. Mormons believe that Native Americans are actually Israelites who moved to America in 600 BC. They believe that. They believe it on faith. We know it's not true. We know it's not true because we can do DNA analysis and show that the Indians in the USA cannot possibly be related to the Israelites in Israel. But it is still believed on faith. You can believe on faith that donkeys will talk, or snakes will talk to you and persuade you to eat apples, or that you can live in the belly of a whale, or even that the sun can stand still in the sky, even though it doesn't actually go around. But you can believe that on faith. And there are no limits to what you can believe on faith. And it's also dangerous that when you're potentially believing things that are not true, it's potentially dangerous that you can believe them with certainty. You cannot argue with a person who believes that he's certainly right, even when he's got no evidence. I can't present you with evidence that you're wrong. If you believe you're certainly right, there has to be a gap where we can start to talk. And if you're not prepared to look at evidence, there's no gap. I'm going to return time and time again to this question of denying evidence. Faith causes people to deny perfectly good, sound evidence. We see it time and time again. I'm going to return to it. It's the only way you can end up believing things that just can't be true. Is by denying the evidence that they are true. And we return to that. The bottom line though, and I'm sure everybody agrees with me, is you cannot use faith as a path to truth. There have to be other methods. So if you're not going to use faith, what are you going to use? What about logical arguments? Could I just see a show of hands? Anyone in here who believes in gods? Is there anyone in here who believes in gods who does not think there's a single logical argument for his or her belief? You understand? You believe in God, but you think there are no arguments to support that belief. No valid arguments. Okay, so everyone here, if you think there are arguments, you think they're true. Lots of people over the years have attempted to show by argumentation, philosophical argumentation, theological argumentation, that God is true. Here are a few up to the 11th century. Many of those, I'm sure people even who are not theological will have heard of. Lucian and Anselm and Thomas Aquinas. These are very, very famous names. Many of those people have come up with arguments for the existence of God. In fact, over the too many years that I've been interested in the existence of God, I've come up with 36 I've found, not my arguments, but I've discovered 36 arguments for the existence of God. And my proposition to you today is that every single one of them is fallacious. Now, I'm not going to prove that to you today because that will take more than one lecture. But I'll make a challenge to you. My name is Bill Flavell. You can find me on Facebook. If you think you have one argument for God that's valid, put it on my page and I'll discuss it with you. I've never yet found anyone who's able to give me one valid argument for the existence of God. So what then determines belief? Today there are 22 major religions, and a major religion is one that's believed in by 1 million people or more. That's quite a lot of religions, and they can't all be true. Just as a little breakdown, if you're not familiar with the numbers, Christians, 2.1 billion, biggest single group. Muslims, 1.5 billion. The non-religious, which includes me by the way, is 1.1 billion. I think I'm the one. And Hindus, 1 billion. In fact, in 2012, the non-religious overtook Hindus on this table. So the fastest growing group is actually non-religious in the entire world. The fastest growing religious group is Muslims. So the final 1.3 billion are made up of the other 19 religions that are not specified there. I mean, one thing that this might make you think is that with thousands of very smart philosophers over 2,000 years trying to figure out what's true and what's not true in religion and gods, how come we still believe in so many gods? The fact is that when you look at a map, you see the reason for it. When you look at a map, you see South America is almost entirely Christian, almost entirely Catholic. North America, almost entirely Christian, almost entirely Protestant. India, very largely Hindu, with some other groups. As you go across the globe, you find great swathes of religion. So why are they clustered? You know, if there's a God, and the God talks to people, and the God wishes them to believe in Him, why do we believe geographically and not kind of randomly? The truth is that religion is passed to you from your family and your community. If you look at the United Kingdom, most people are Protestant because Protestantism began in the United Kingdom with Henry VIII. But you do find Hindus, and you do find Muslims, and you find Sikhs. You find a lot of other religions, but nearly all of those people emigrated to the UK as Sikhs or Hindus or Muslims. That's how it works. You actually follow the religion of your family. The religion of your family, with a very high degree of accuracy, predicts your religion. There doesn't seem to be any room for God there. It's your family persuades you and you believe. And in fact, one of the things your family does is to persuade you that you have to believe this on faith. Remember faith, no evidence? And then once you believe as a young person, and you believe on faith, you're likely to continue to believe because you think faith is valuable and important up into your old age in that religion you're brought up in. So let's just summarise some conclusions so far. Faith is not a path to truth. It's very often a path to delusion, but it's not ever a path to truth. The philosophers and theologians have failed to give us adequate reasons to believe or disbelieve in any gods. Religion propagates by culture, not by God speaking to people, but by culture. And of course, because of all that, it's quite clear, it's actually really hard to show that God exists. And I'm not claiming that's a reason not to believe God exists. It could just be hard. You know, God could generally be hiding, generally be undetectable, so God may exist. None of that is a reason not to believe in God. Those reasons are coming. Can science help? Let's just quickly run through science. I think most of us, if not all of us, will agree that science has been extraordinarily successful. We've learned more about our universe in the last 400 years than in all the thousands of years before that. We now know the makeup of the cosmos. We know the component parts of the cosmos. We've seen and understand the birth and the death of stars. And from that huge level, we can go down to the micro level, and we understand the way materials are made. We can understand atoms, and even the components that make up atoms. All of our knowledge of the world before 400 years ago was speculation. Now it's based on solid evidence of experimentation and conclusions that we can draw that are warranted. And actually, the rate of learning is growing. I can't remember the figures. I saw a paper a little while ago showing the number of academic papers that were produced, and it's going up every year. In fact, it's going up exponentially. So, not every paper is a great contribution to our knowledge, but every paper is a little contribution to our knowledge, and there are a lot of papers. The reason we know science works is because we live by the fruits of science every day. You know, I could only have come here because I could fly, and an aeroplane only works because there's been a vast amount of science done to establish all the parameters that allow 500 people to fly 5,000 miles at 540 miles an hour. We have completely eliminated smallpox from the planet. We've eliminated some other diseases as well. And this has only been done with science. There is no evidence of faith ever eliminating any disease from the planet. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, has got a mobile phone. And mobile phones, telephones, computer systems, the internet, TV, all of these things are valued on science. And they work, and we use them every day, we take them for granted. The bottom line is that science works. But can it work with God? That's the question we're really here today to think about. One sentence on what is science. The thing about science is that it's a systematic exploration of things. It's using observation and experiment and logic, and it uses it in a rigorous way, and it relies upon very, very rigorous testing and validation of our data. And it's only through this painstaking, slow, methodical process that we really learn things about the universe, I think. Before we do that, how is your logic? I'd just like to ask you a few questions to see whether your view of logic and my view of logic is the same. So what I'm going to do is ask you some questions and ask for a show of hands. We know that complex life exists on Earth. Actually, we've got no idea how it started. What rational conclusion can you draw from those facts? Number one, can you conclude that life must have arrived from outer space? Anyone conclude that? Life must have arrived from outer space. We've got a few, three or four people agreeing with that. Number two, life must have arisen spontaneously from simple chemicals. Can we conclude that? Anyone? Yeah, just like one person brave enough, but two brave enough to agree to that one. Number three, a supernatural being must have created life. Anyone agree to that? That does seem pretty overwhelming. Number four, no conclusion is possible. And that is the correct answer. No conclusion is possible. The fact of the matter is that all three of those, 1, 2 and 3, are possible. Unless we can rule them out. Can you rule them out? They're possible. So if they're possible, why would you say a supernatural being must have created life? It may have come from outer space. Or it may have arisen spontaneously from simple chemicals. And actually there are more options than that. I've just given you 3. If you can't rule those things out with certainty, there's still options, and therefore you cannot conclude that a supernatural being must have created life. That is irrational. Another question. See if you can do better with this one. Imagine that somebody proves, this is hypothetical because this is not going to happen, but imagine somebody proves that evolutionary theory is wrong. What justified conclusion can you draw from that? Can you conclude that therefore creationism must be true? Okay, there's some agreement to that. Can you agree that creationism is probably true? Okay, rather than more agreement to that. Can you conclude that creationism is not true? Okay, one person would say that. And finally, can you conclude that no conclusion is possible? Yes, well, that is the right answer, of course. The truth is that it isn't a simple dichotomy between evolution and creationism. There might be, even if evolution is wrong, there might be another explanation for the existence of, for the evolution of life, for the existence of many varied species on Earth, which is what we're talking about, than creationism. So this doesn't rule out creationism. Creationism may be true, but if you want to argue for creationism, you must bring the evidence. Right now, the evolution, those people that support evolution have the evidence. They have reams of it, mountains of it. The people who believe in creationism have got none of it. So even if we push aside all that evidence for evolution, the creationists don't win by default. You have to bring your own evidence. One more. I'm enjoying this. Is something probably true because billions of people believe it? No, no one thinks that's true. Is something probably true because people are willing to die for it? No one believes it. People do argue that to me, but nobody believes it here. Is something probably right because it feels absolutely right? No. Hey, guys, you're doing well. Of course. Is something probably right because you respect your father, your pastor, your teacher tell you it's true? Is something probably right because it's supported by validated evidence? Yes. Thank you. Well, that was good. What I'm going to try to do is use the scientific method, which I think just about everyone in this room is going to be at least as familiar with as I am, probably more familiar, to establish whether we can prove that God exists. Run through that very quickly. The scientific method involves observations which lead to you asking questions. For example, you may say, why do we have lung cancer? What causes lung cancer? At that point, you create some hypotheses. You create some possible answers to that question. And one answer you may come up with is smoking causes lung cancer. That is falsifiable. That is a hypothesis that is falsifiable. We can prove whether that's true or not true. And in science, you have to come up with falsifiable hypotheses. And the way you do that is you come up with some predictions. If smoking is caused by lung cancer, then I can make some predictions. For example, I can predict that those countries with the highest incidence of smoking will have the highest incidence of lung cancer. Those countries with the lowest incidence of smoking will have the lowest incidence of lung cancer. Those countries with a growing rate of smoking will have a growing rate of lung cancer. You can gather your data and then you can test your predictions. And if the predictions are correct, does that mean your hypothesis is correct? No, it doesn't mean it's correct. What it means is you've supported it. It means it may be correct. You haven't ruled it out. This is the important thing about science, is that we don't really prove anything, we just rule things out. until those things that are left become supported better and better. So, in this case of lung cancer, if we find that the data does support our predictions, we would then make some more predictions and test and test and test. And we would get other groups in other parts of the world to do the same thing. And the more times you go around that loop, repeat until confident, the more confident you are that your hypothesis is correct. What if, when you do that test, when you look to see whether those predictions are correct about the country's rates of smoking and rates of lung cancer, what if you find it's wrong? Data doesn't show that at all. Then your hypothesis is rejected. You have to bin it. You have to throw it away. Science can disprove things. It can't prove anything. Does anybody want to ask a question on that particular issue? Because this is crucial to the rest. Sorry, I really couldn't hear that. Could you repeat it? When the phone's off?
Science or the translator does not prove anything, but it just proves out in prove.
Yeah.
So that part is so ruled out.
Does someone hear that? Can you repeat it to me? Because I think
He said, science does not rule out any, does not prove anything, but rules out certain things.
yeah.
Does that fact rule out science?
No.
There's
Because as you go through that loop of testing and testing, more predictions, you get more and more confidence that you're true, that the things you're talking about are correct. What you never get in science is 100% confidence. But that's not a weakness of science, that's a strength of science. There's nothing else that gets close to it in terms of understanding the world. It's the best we've got. So what we have in science is we have a mechanism which pretty reliably finds the best explanation for facts. As I've said, it can't prove anything that is to be true, but it can prove things to be false. And that's the crucial thing. And it works. We know it works because I'm here and I wouldn't be without science. Now we get on to the God bit. Okay, we've looked at the background, we've looked at faith, we've looked at argumentation, philosophy, theology, all very, very briefly. We've looked at the scientific method, but now we've got to look at God. Before I can even start to think about proving whether God exists or not through science, I have to be clear what God it is that I'm talking about. Now, I understand that most people in this room are Christians, and I understand that you will not all have an identical view of what God is. There will be differences in the room, maybe even dramatic differences. I suspect, for example, most of you will believe that God answers prayers in some shape or form, and there will be some people who doesn't think that He does. So what I have to do now, in order just to make this presentation and to give you the methodology, is to come up with a definition of God which I think most people will agree with, but certainly not everyone. And please, if you don't agree with my definition of God, don't argue with me about it, argue with the pastors. I'm coming up with one. If you don't agree with me, you just have to live with the fact that I'm looking at this particular definition, and you can use the methodology that I'm presenting to decide whether your version of God exists. Okay? Number one, what is God? God is an intangible spirit, which means He's not made of atoms and molecules. Actually, we don't know what He's made of. It's a mystery. And certainly you can't perceive Him with your normal senses, although I do understand that He talks to some people. God is the creator of the universe and of all life in the universe.
You wouldn't like to define a spirit. What is a spirit?
I'd love to if I could. But I have no idea. God made himself known to us through the Bible. So this makes the Bible a crucial document for Christians. However, I also understand that in this room will be people who think the Bible is literally true from Genesis through to Revelations, and people who think, well, it's not all true. Some of it is myth, some of it is poetry, some of it is metaphor, but it's basically true. So there'll be a lot of differences of opinion in the room on that. However, I'm going to say I'm on the camp right now of those people who say he made himself known through the Bible. So you don't have to literally believe every word of the Bible to use this proof. God is personal, and that means that God will address you as an individual, get to know you as an individual, you can get to know God to some extent, and he's concerned about you. God is concerned about his creation. He made you for a reason, and he wants you to do well, be happy and thrive and prosper. And God is infinitely loving. Just want you to think for a second what this means. Think of the person in the world that you love most. Think what it would be like if you loved him or her a billion times more, and then you're not even close to how much God loves you. It's important that you remember that. God is infinitely loving. Okay, I won't ask if anyone disagrees with this, but does anyone agree that this is a fair summary of Christian God? Okay. Maybe half the people think that's fair. So how do we detect God? We can't detect him with our senses. I think we're pretty clear about that. So I think one of the gentlemen in the audience asked me yesterday, are you going to show us God with your oscilloscope? No, I'm not going to do that. But if God intervenes in our world, we can detect the effect of his intervention in the world. And that is what science is good at. Science is good at detecting physical things. So if God intervenes and he makes a change in the world which would not have happened if God hadn't done it, then there is something we can measure and something we can determine whether the evidence is there or not. So I've got to the point in the tree, remember the tree for the scientific method, I've got to the point in the flowchart, I've got to the point where we need to create some hypotheses with God. And the first one I'm going to suggest is that God created the universe and all life forms around 10,000 years ago. There are lots of Christians that believe that to be true. The second one is, I'm going to say, our hypothesis, the Bible is there because God inspired the Bible. I'm also going to say, as a hypothesis, that God answers believers' prayers. He doesn't have to answer all prayers for this to be true, but he has to answer a reasonable number. He has to answer millions a day rather than one every 10 years. If God answers one every 10 years, it's not detectable. If God answers millions a day, most certainly it is detectable. And we mentioned that God has infinite love. I'm going to say in my hypothesis that God loves all humans equally. It doesn't matter the colour of your skin, whether you're disabled, what you do in life, your status in the world. He loves everyone infinitely and equally.
Only human beings, not animals?
I don't think he loves animals at all, if I read the Bible correctly. He gave us 2 million lovely animals. So these are our hypotheses, and we now have to come up with some predictions that we can test with data. So the first hypothesis, God created the universe and all life forms about 10,000 years ago. I'm going to predict, therefore, there'll be no evidence of anything existing before about 10,000 years ago. And secondly, I'm going to predict that all life forms appeared suddenly in the fossil record about 10,000 years ago. God inspired the Bible. So I'm going to predict that the Bible, even though it was written by men, and men made mistakes and made errors, the Bible should be generally an accurate description of the Earth, the solar system, and the cosmos, even if it's couched in Iron Age terms. It should be accurate, it shouldn't be fundamentally flawed. I'm going to predict, from the hypothesis that God answers believers' prayers, I'm going to predict that groups with the highest proportion of believers should have enhanced well-being compared with those who worship false gods, that's to say non-Christian gods in this case, or no gods at all. The hypothesis that God loves all human beings equally, I'm going to predict that God would not favour one group, for example a race or a gender or a disability group, over other groups, and therefore believers should have their prayers answered in roughly equal proportions, regardless of their race or their disability, for example. Now we need to look at the evidence. We predicted that there's no evidence of anything existing before about 10,000 years ago. When I look at the evidence, there's a lot of evidence. There's tons of evidence that stuff existed before 10,000 years ago. One of the simplest bits of evidence is you can count the number of years that have passed by looking at the layers of dust in glaciers. And all around the world, the cores of glaciers have been taken, and little by little you can count the number of years this glacier has been forming. And the oldest ones I'm aware of have been forming for 740,000 years, which is much more than 10,000 years. Archaeologists have found paths where early humans made fire, and they've dated the bones and other relics around the hearth to around about 1 million years. There are many of these, by the way, in different parts of the world. This is not isolated. So the earliest use of fire for cooking was about 1 million years ago. There are lots of different methods of radiometric dating. They rely upon understanding the relative decay of different elements. And by measuring the existence of different elements, you can figure out roughly, in fact quite accurately, usually to within better than 5%, how old the sample is. There are lots of different methods, so if one method doesn't work in one situation, another method will, and very often you can use multiple methods to confirm your observation. Meteorites that have fallen to Earth have been measured, and many of them are more than 4 billion years old. That's billion years old. There's a class of stars called white dwarf stars. Stars die, and the smaller ones extinguish themselves. The larger ones tend to explode into supernovae. The smaller ones extinguish themselves and just die, but they're still very, very hot. And because we understand the rate of cooling, we can, by measuring the temperature of the stars, we can figure out how long they've been cooling. So in other words, how long ago they died. And the oldest ones that we're aware of died more than 12 billion years ago. And of course, we probably all know about the Big Bang. We know that the universe is expanding, we know the rate of expansion, we know the size of the universe, and we can figure out pretty reasonably accurately how long it's been expanding. It's been expanding for about 13.7 billion years. all of these different bits of evidence fit together perfectly. They come from multiple sources. It's like giving you a tiny, tiny fraction of the evidence. The truth is that the prediction that nothing will exist before 10,000 years ago is false. It is not true. And in fact, it's not even close.
You can add even the existence of dinosaurs, which people understand commonly.
Well, the dinosaurs were killed off about 65 million years ago. That's long before 10,000
That
years
is
ago.
understandable. Many people won't understand some of these things.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
Physicists will understand, but common man
Okay.
understand.
So we just take one question, please. Is the microphone working now?
Yeah. Going by the first hypothesis that has been made that the Earth, according to the Bible, was created not less than, or not more than 10,000 years ago, right? Now, if we prove that hypothesis to be wrong, let's say going by the scientific method, why then should we choose to immediately, how can I put it, infer that the evidence from the Bible is wrong? Why not follow the same scientific method and conclude that the inception of the first hypothesis was wrong? Maybe that the methods that were used to come up with that hypothesis were wrong and not what the hypothesis implies.
Okay, I heard the question. All I'm doing here is proving that that hypothesis is wrong. Now, you may not accept that hypothesis is true in the first place. Many people won't accept that's true. So I'm only proving that that hypothesis is wrong. That hypothesis is wrong. Trust me, that is wrong. And anyone who believes that is wrong. That hypothesis is wrong. Now, you can still believe in God and not believe in that hypothesis. So, I'm not ruling out God with this, I'm simply ruling out that hypothesis. You follow me?
I suspect it comes back to genealogy in the Bible, because they mention really important.
That hypothesis about the world being 10,000 years old. I know some bishop in 1755 called Pasha. He's the first one who said the world was probably 7,000 years old.
Yeah.
Counted back up to about 2,000 years, 6,000 years, starting from Adam up.
I think if you actually do the genealogy, even though there's multiple genealogies in the Bible, if you do it, you get to about 6,000 odd years. So I'm being generous by giving you 10,000. Somebody suggested I hold off on questions until the end, so please do write your questions down. Don't forget them, because I do want to hear them. But if we talk too much in between the presentation, it'll break up the flow and you may not follow the logic so well. The second prediction is that all life forms appeared suddenly in the fossil record about 10,000 years ago. The earliest fossilized life forms that we know of are more than 3 billion years old. They are single-cell organisms with no nucleus. If you go back to that level, 3 billion years ago, that's all you can find. You can't find any dinosaurs. You can't find any monkeys. You can't find any frogs. If you go back 310 million years, you can find reptiles. Before that, you don't find any reptiles. If you go back 225 million years, you start to find mammals in the fossil record. You don't find them before that. And in fact, I'll give you 3 examples there. You can look at every different type of life form, and you see they appear at some point in the fossil record. And between the earliest life and the latest life that we found, we're talking about 3 or 4 billion years, actually, nearly 4 billion years. The idea that everything will be found at the same time is preposterous. It's not true. The data does not show that to be the case. Now, if there's an objection, I will tell you that probably can't read it from that. this what do you call it? This cross section of the geological timescale, going from invertebrates at the bottom in the Paleozoic era up to modern mammals, and in the Cenozoic era, that is an artist's impression. You may not find that everywhere, you may not find it anywhere, but you can find all the components of that in multiple places all around the world. And you never find reptiles before 310 million years ago. So the idea that all life forms appear suddenly in the fossil record 10,000 years ago is false. It's not even close. Now this one, I might need Digital's help for this one, faster. This one is the accurate descriptions of the Earth, the solar system and the cosmos. We should find in the Bible fairly accurate descriptions. I know you can't read this, that's slide at the back. So I'm just going to talk a little, I'm not going to read every word on there, it's too much. I'm convinced that the Bible talks about a flat Earth that's fixed in space and unmoving, and has a dome over the top of it, which it calls a firmament, and has lights, which it calls stars, which are placed in the firmament by God. For example, in Isaiah 24:1, Isaiah says, "Behold, the Lord will lay waste the earth and make it empty, turn it upside down, and scatter abroad its inhabitants thereof." Well, it's kind of hard to think of the idea of turning a globe upside down. So flat Earth, yeah, definitely you can see that. This way up, that way up, it's upside down, people fall off. Not only is it not flat, but if you understood gravity, you would understand you could turn it upside down, it would fall off. So that's a total misunderstanding of how the world is. Samuel 2:8 talks about the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and upon them he set the earth. Actually, the earth doesn't have any pillars. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also, and God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light upon the earth. Well, that suggests that the stars were formed after the earth. Well, we know that most of the stars were formed before the earth. So it is all fundamentally wrong. It's false. That prediction is false. The data does not show that prediction to be true. Next one. Groups with the highest proportion of believers will have enhanced well-being compared to those who worship false gods or no gods. There is evidence. I'll have to explain this table a little bit. The importance of religion in those countries. And the importance of religion has been measured by... This is from a Gallup survey, a World Health survey, and it asks people the simple question, how important is religion important to you in your daily life? And if you answer yes, you're one of the 97% who answered yes for Zambia. I've chosen Zambia because it's almost entirely a Christian nation. Almost everybody believes in God. I've chosen Pakistan because it's almost entirely Muslim nation and almost everybody believes in God. I've chosen Japan because not only is it the least religious country in the world, actually in Japan only 4% of people are certain that God exists. But it's also a non-Christian country. There are very few Christians in Japan. There are Buddhists, Shintoists, but there are very, very few Christians. So if they're praying Shinto, I'm not even sure if you pray to Shinto. I don't think you should pray to Shinto. Yahweh is not going to be listening, Jesus is not going to be listening to you. So Japan is a good example of a country that there's very little praying going on in Japan. In fact, there is data on the amount of prayer in each country. I couldn't get it for all 4 countries, so I didn't display it. But prayer in Zambia is massive. You know, almost everybody prays daily in Zambia. Prayer in Japan is almost ceremonial. It happens for occasions like deaths and births. Norway is an ex-Christian country, which also has very low levels of religiosity. Something like 75% of the people in Norway don't believe in God. Norway and Japan also two of the most prosperous countries in the world. But let's look at some measures. When do people pray? Well, they pray routinely for all sorts of things. Where the hell did I put my keys? I hope I can find a car parking space in the car park. I hope the electricity is not full when I get there. But they also pray for serious things. If your wife is going into labour, you're going to pray for her. A family are going to pray for her. You're going to pray for the baby. You're going to pray for the wife. If somebody's sick, you're going to pray for them. If somebody goes on a journey, you're going to pray for them. If somebody has an accident, you're going to pray that they get well. Now, if those prayers are being answered, we would expect some benefits to ensue, and one measure of that is your life expectancy. If you're having all those prayers answered and the poor Japanese and Norwegians having no prayers answered, you're going to have an advantage. Except that you guys live for 55 years on average. That is the male-female life expectancy at birth in Zambia, 2012. In Pakistan, they do slightly better, 67 years. Japan have almost 30 years advantage. They live for 83 years on average. And Norway, 81 years, very, very similar to Japan. But it doesn't look like there's much advantage in praying there. In fact, it looks like it's rather dangerous to pray. Infant mortality is the number of deaths of babies in the first year of life, and you measure it as the number of deaths per 1,000 births, per 1,000 live births. Infant mortality in Zambia is 68 per 1,000. Pakistan is 59. In Japan it's 2. Norway is 3. Actually, I've shown you 4 countries here, but if we were to look at all of the countries, you would see this is a continuum. This is roughly a trend. And the more religious you are, the worse off you are in all these measures. The more you pray, the worse off you are. And finally, I've got infant and more big ones. I've got maternal mortality, which is shocking. This is literally shocking. It's the deaths of mothers per 100,000 births. In Zambia, 440 mothers die for every 100,000 births. In Pakistan, 260. Japan, 5. Norway, 7. Figures under 10 are commonplace in the unpraying world. In those countries that don't pray, figures under 10 are absolutely common. You'll find that in Europe, Sweden, Finland, Japan, France, Germany, Italy. In all of those countries, you'll find under 10 per 100,000.
This clearly proves that God doesn't like prayer.
Yeah, maybe the answer is God doesn't like praying. But I mean, he certainly doesn't answer these prayers. The evidence is that prayer does not lead to better outcomes. So those people, so this prediction, which is that due to the high proportion of believers will have enhanced well-being, is just not true. And in fact, the opposite is true. People who pray most have shockingly worse outcomes than people who pray constantly. That's not true. Do you know what your murder rate is in Zambia? Your murder rate is 10 times the murder rate in the UK. It's not true. In fact, if I've got time afterwards, I'll show you the data for murders. All of the religious countries have much higher murder rates than the non-religious countries. The only exception to that was Islamic countries. Islamic countries, even those that are very religious, have low-ish murder rates. Not as low as the non-Christian, not as low as the non-believing countries, but low murder rates. Certainly lower than the Christian countries. We can look at all of them, and you are wrong. Christianity does not lead to better behaviour. Can I take a sorry. There's another prediction we made. I think this is the last one. God, because remember we talked about infinite love and what it really meant. God would not favour one group over other groups. So what I'm doing here is I'm eliminating all those differences between countries. Because obviously there are differences in countries that are more developed and less developed. It's just that prayer doesn't help you. But what I'm doing now is I'm looking at people in one country, I'm looking at Americans, and I'm comparing black Americans with white Americans. And I've got similar data. First of all, importance of religion. White Americans, 54% think religion is important in their day-to-day life, but black Americans it's 79%. So the blacks are rather more religious than the white people. If we look at life expectancy, the white people have an advantage. It's not much this time, but it's still 5 years. So black people die 5 years earlier than white people. If we look at neonatal mortality, that is deaths of babies within 28 days of birth per 1,000 live births. The whites have 3.8 of their babies dying, and the blacks have 8.9, more than double. It is quite significant. And if we look at maternal mortality, which is one of the data lines we looked at in the previous slide, white mothers die at a rate of 8.7 per 100,000, and black mothers in the same country who are more religious die at a rate of 30.5 per 100,000. So what's happening here? What is happening here? Is God discriminating against black people? Does he not like you guys? Or does he favour the whites? But there's something else which I think is even more telling. People who believe in prayer believe that God will answer your prayers. And if you pray and you're sick, he can make you well. I bet everybody who's a Christian in this room believes that to be the case. But then we have to ask, why is it that there are certain problems that God never cures? If you have an amputated leg, it doesn't really matter how much you pray, how sincerely you pray, how many people pray for you, how long you pray, it's not going to grow back again. If you have a cleft palate or Down syndrome, you are not going to be made well by prayer. Why does he discriminate? Why does God discriminate? If he answers prayers, why does he shut off these people and give them no hope, no chance? Never, ever answer their prayers. You have to conclude when you look at this data that God is discriminating. If he's answering prayers, he's answering more prayers to white people, and he's answering more prayers to people with flu and people with Down syndrome. So I have to conclude that this prediction is false. It is not true that God doesn't favour. It is not true that God treats everybody, which is a prediction. I'm almost there, but I know you want to answer a question. To my conclusions, we started with 4 hypotheses. God created the universe and all life forms around 10,000 years ago. God inspired the Bible. God answers believers' prayers, and God loves all human beings equally. When we tested them, all hypotheses failed. What does that mean? That means we have to reject the hypothesis. And that means a God with those characteristics does not exist. Does not mean a God with different characteristics doesn't exist. But if you believe in that God, your God doesn't exist. Your God is imaginary. There are 4 possible things you could respond to me today. 4 ways you can respond to me. One is you can find errors in my logic. Yeah, I'm fallible. There may be errors in the logic. Or you could find errors in my data. You could say the United Nations survey is not right. I think you actually can't find the errors in the data is correct. But I may have copied it down or there's possibilities. So you could look at the data and see whether I made errors in the data. There is one shocking possibility, and that is that you could agree with me. Or you could just say it's all rubbish, bury your head in the sand and go home. And you know what, this is what most people do. And it's fine, if that's what you want to do, it's absolutely fine. So finally, you know, humans can be enslaved by their culture. Two things that drive human behaviour more than anything else are your culture and your emotions. We like to think we're rational human beings. The truth is, we use our reason to justify our emotions and our culture most of the time. This is the nature of humans. The result of that is that we're actually, in some ways, enslaved by our culture. I want to tell you the story of Papua New Guinea. In Papua New Guinea, there was a disease called kuru. It was an encephalitis. It was a damage to the brain that made you lose memory and then lose all your abilities until you finally died. They had it for many years. And in the early 50s, some sociologists and anthropologists went to study them to try and figure out why they were getting so much of this disease. And they found that these people in Papua New Guinea, the way in which they showed their love for their relatives was to eat them when they died. And they found that the men had more of this encephaly, kuru, than the women. That's interesting. They all ate the body. But they found that the tastiest and the most important part of the body to eat, that passed the spirit of that person from them to you, is the brain. So the men feasted on the brain and the women feasted on the limbs. And ultimately, scientists, using science, discovered that there was a prion protein which causes kuru. And because the men ate the brain, this prion protein was lodged in the nervous system, including the brain, was passed to the men, and within 7 to 14 years, the men developed kuru. And it's partly because of this long time span between ingesting the prion protein and the disease coming to manifesting that it wasn't obvious to the islanders, but it was obvious to the scientists. Now, okay, so scientists come and tell you this. Your culture is not doing you any good, guys. You need to change it. You must stop eating your dead people. I think it took 20 years for them to persuade them. And in those 20 years, a lot of other people got kuru and died. Now, the Australian government made it illegal for them to eat their dead people. They continued to do it for several years after it was illegal, but now they have stopped. Your culture can enslave you. And the thing about cultural beliefs is they're not guaranteed to be true. You know, they're not guaranteed to be helpful, and they're not guaranteed to be true. If you're a Christian and you believe that there's only one God and that God is Yahweh, Jesus, then you know that the Hindus who worship Shiva and Brahma and Vishnu and several thousand other gods, you know that they're wrong. And they know that you're wrong too. The fact is, whatever you believe is passed down through your culture is not necessarily true. Nothing guarantees it to be true. So, all of us have a choice. We can embrace reason and we can demand evidence for everything before we believe it, which is what I started doing when I was 13. Or we can deny reason and we can do nothing. So I just have one final question for you. Can science say anything about the existence of God? I think we've got one more person. Thank you.